Now I would like to introduce Danny. He has such a varied and interesting background. Starting with a successful entrepreneurial venture, which he launched while still a Brown student, to running his current company, Do Ventures. Basically, it's his platform to launch and develop a portfolio of new and quickly growing companies, such as G-Form, his current venture, and to advise a variety of others. Also, I believe he is quickly becoming one of the most sought-after professors on campus, if the students who registered for this webinar are any indication. Danny, please share with us some information about your journey and your best practices for these budding entrepreneurs on the call.
Thank you very much, Heather, and thank you to everybody who joined today. It's rewarding to hear that there's so many Brown alums are interested in this topic of entrepreneurship, which I have a ton of passion for, and I hope to convey today in the next hour. I see lots of names that I recognize from my days as a student on campus, and I certainly see names that I recognize now from being a professor. So thank you to everybody for joining. The format, as Heather said, I hope will be somewhat conversational. I'm going to take a number of minutes to lay out the groundwork on a number of topics that I think will be useful and helpful to everybody. I hope they'll be inspirational and motivational and also practical. And I hope we'll have some time to interact a little bit on specific questions you may have about your own venture or ideas you have that you might look to launch. So let me start by introducing myself in a little bit more detail with a few bullets that I think will underscore what Heather said about my background and about what I'm doing now. And the first bullet is that I like to describe myself, and others describe me, as a serial entrepreneur. And if you haven't heard that phrase before, it doesn't mean that I focused on breakfast products. It means that serially I've been involved with starting and developing and eventually harvesting a whole series of entrepreneurial ventures. And typically, I have not been the domain expert. I'm not the technology expert. I'm not the person who knows how to program the computer or develop the food product. But over the years, I've developed experience and I hope expertise in commercializing a venture, taking a core idea and helping a team bring it to market. My background educationally is, of course, I'm on the call right now because I'm a Brown alum. I was a history major, class of '87, and a little bit of traditional business training from Harvard Business School and involved in brand management at Procter & Gamble. Enough to know that a domain like that was not really a good fit for me, and sometimes that's an important part of the trajectory of an entrepreneur, to know what's not something you want to do. I'm a founder, investor, advisor. I serve various roles, as Heather mentioned, in this portfolio called Do Ventures. Sometimes I'm one of the absolute founders, as is the case in G-Form, which you'll hear a little bit about. Other times I'm a joiner, and in other cases I'm an advisor. So different roles leveraging the experience I've had in entrepreneurship. And then I've had the really good fortune, it's one of the blessings that I've had from Brown, frankly, over the past 6 or 7 years after Barrett Hazeltine tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, it would be great if you could teach entrepreneurship at Brown, take one of your Harvard Business School classes and weave in some of what you've learned as an entrepreneur yourself. And when Barrett asked me, I literally thought he was joking, because I said, geez, I've never taught anything, not even Sunday school. How could you be asking me to teach at Brown of all places? And as many of you know, probably all of you know, Barrett sees in people things that they don't necessarily see themselves and is very inspirational, and he was to me. And the thing in my life, my professional life, about which I think I have the most passion is teaching entrepreneurship. And I hope the students of mine and alumni on the line can attest to that. So I've had the good fortune to be able to do that at Brown as part of the entrepreneurship faculty. That led me to being on the MBA faculty at Tel Aviv University, where I teach in the summers, and also to do entrepreneurship workshops around the world in various places. Egypt a couple of times, which was led through a Brown student of mine who's in Egypt, Portugal, Israel, other places, and China. And I do that in academic contexts and also in professional contexts. So very briefly, the 4 things I wanted to talk about today, and it's a little bit too ambitious to try to tackle all of entrepreneurship in 1 hour phone call. At least I hope so. Otherwise, my students may wonder why we're taking the whole semester to cover these topics. but just to plant a few seeds in some rudimentary ways. And then I'm happy to be in touch and share additional resources. First is options for starting a venture. Where do you get started? There's a couple of different fundamental places, and we'll talk about those. Analyzing your venture's 4 key elements and how they fit together. And this will be a model that my students and alumni will be familiar with. Using a certain kind of research to find what I would describe as an unmet need, something that is needed in a marketplace, but using a specific kind of research called bottom-up research, which is not something that a lot of entrepreneurs or enough entrepreneurs do. And then finally, asking key questions to formulate 3 things: a value proposition, a business model, and a business strategy. So in an hour, I hope we'll be able to cover all those and then amplify them through your questions. So in terms of where to start, I like to describe 2 places where you can start. I love this quote, by the way, by Isaac Asimov, which I think emphasizes one of the places. And it's a place where I happen to emphasize, at least in my teaching at Brown, because my teaching happens through the engineering school. And so there's a lot of emphasis on technology. But fundamentally, you can start with, more broadly, a unique capability, something that you or your team can do or capture or protect and integrate as the forming basis for where you start to launch a venture. Often it is technology, and often, as this quote by Isaac Asimov indicates, it's not a dramatic breakthrough every time that will herald the launch of a new product or a new venture, but it's something where you begin to scratch your head and you say, I'm not quite sure I understand that. I'm a little bit puzzled, but maybe that'll lead me to something that's unique and that can form the basis of a new venture. And I thought what I'm going to do, and it's no surprise to people who've heard me speak before, I'm going to weave in a number of very short case studies to illustrate these concepts. My students are familiar with my using Harvard Business School case studies. And in my examples today, I'm going to use a couple that I'm part of or have been part of. And I deliberately tried to weave in a few that my students have launched from my classes here at Brown, partly to celebrate what's happening entrepreneurially at Brown in the curriculum, and partly because I want to illustrate that you don't necessarily need a ton of experience or even any experience to be an entrepreneur. You can leverage your raw smarts and what you've learned in your prior academic work or your prior professional work to launch something. And I hope that'll be part of the inspiration that you get. So this first example is an example of starting with a unique capability, in our case, G-Forum. I'm one of the founders. I'm now the executive chairman, based on technology. We came across and then created a variant of a raw technology that allows the technology to absorb impact in a really novel and unprecedented way. And so we've used that technology to create a line of athletic gear, padding for different body parts for athletes, elbow pads, shin guards, knee pads. And then we use the same technology platform to protect consumer electronic devices. And you may have seen in that video us doing crazy things like dropping an iPad from an airplane, or parachuting out of an airplane and throwing an iPhone, or we launched an iPad up into space 20 miles and dropped it from there, and it smashes on the ground and is unscathed, working perfectly. And so we started with the technology, and we applied that technology to a couple of different consumer areas of athletic wear and consumer electronics, and now we're expanding into the military and healthcare and a few other things. So I won't go into too much more detail, but I think it's a good example, and it's certainly one that I'm living every day as one of the founders and, as I say, executive chairman of G-Forum, and it's grown really fast. We're just about 2 years old. We're now venture-backed. We have 55 people in offices in 11 countries, including Dubai, Germany, the UK, Hungary, Poland, Croatia, Russia, India, and a few others. And so just from the germ, the seed of some proprietary technology that we partly discovered and then modified, we've created a 55-person company applying that technology to a number of areas that consumers are interested in. Just having a little trouble advancing the slide. Okay. So then the alternative way, if you don't have a technology, and many of us don't, is that you can start with a market need. And that means you figure out, and we'll talk a little bit about some techniques for how to figure out, that there's something in the marketplace that's needed, and then you go find a solution and create it. And you see on the screen a line of, it turns out it's a long line if you had more perspective here, of Chinese consumers in Beijing. And I thought this was, I hope, both a good and effective and entertaining example of what this means by starting with a market need. So a couple of years ago, I was invited to go teach in China. And it was an incredibly worthwhile and exciting experience. And of course, as part of my experience there, I did a little sightseeing. The woman who was showing me around on a Friday said, tomorrow we have a really important mission. And that is, we have to go sample the very famous Chinese Milk Way. And I said, what the heck does that mean? I don't even know what Milk Way is. And she described it's sort of like yogurt, and that there's one spot in the oldest section of Beijing that has made this really famous version of Milk Way. And we have to get there early, wait in line, and make sure we get it because they run out at a certain point. And I thought, well, it's kind of an interesting lesson in supply and demand. Maybe they should make more, but nevertheless, I was getting agitated, and I felt like, wow, I don't want to miss out on this really interesting form of Milk Way, realizing I wasn't even sure what it was, but it was built up to be so special. I wanted to make sure we didn't miss it. So I got up really early the next morning, made sure that we caught a cab, zipped across the city of Beijing, went down this alleyway, and my heart dropped because I saw from a distance was this huge line, presumably of people waiting for this very special version of Milk Way. We got in the line. My heart was beating. Am I going to get this famous version? We get up to the front of the line, and sure enough, we got it. And this is what I saw. This was what the Milk Way looked like. And it was in this cute little package, a little blue and white cow on it. And we had two versions. One was kind of sweet, one was savory. And I felt very accomplished that I wanted to make sure that I had this unique experience in China. And sure enough, I'd had the very famous Milk Way. So then we were wrapping up, threw away our containers, and we walked down the street. And right next door, we saw this storefront. No one was in it. It looked like nobody had been in it in weeks. And I said to the woman who was showing me around, Veronica, I said, hey, Veronica, what do they sell here? And without delay, she said, oh, they sell Milk Way here too. And I said, I'm not sure I get it. Why did we get up early, jump in a cab, race across Beijing, wait in line, fret that we weren't going to get this version, only to find that next door we could have gotten Milk Way for no effort? And she scratched her head for a second, and she said, geez, I'm not really sure what you call that phenomenon, but it occurs to me that there's something special about this kind that motivated us to do that. And although I'm sure this Milk Way is fine, nobody cares about it. And I paused and I thought, wow, I had to come all the way around the world to Beijing to find the best example of branding than I could ever imagine. And everywhere I go, anywhere I teach, any companies I work with, I share this example, and so I wanted to share it today. And this was a great example of find or create a unique capability. And in this case, it has nothing to do with technology. In fact, it has very little, if anything, to do with what's in this package. There's no difference really between this Milk Way and this Milk Way. But here, these guys created a brand, and that brand was really valuable. So moving on to a case study quickly that I think exhibits both of the elements that we just talked about. Starting with a unique capability like technology, which is what happened in this case, versus starting with a brand. And I think in this particular case, the entrepreneurs did both. And what I'm proud to say, especially proud of the students, is students in my class developed this particular startup. This is now called Dear Kate. It's had several iterations of branding since it was launched in my class. And Julie Siegel and Eunice Ping launched this company to address a fundamental consumer need that they recognized women were facing, which was leaks, underwear leaks during menstruation. And so they formulated what you see at the bottom of this slide, a now patented formulation of fabrics that absorbs and wicks and is leak resistant in ways that were unprecedented and so therefore patentable. And so that was the basis of the technology for addressing the problem. But probably more important, just like in the Milkway example, the technology itself was not going to help them launch a successful company. And so they've done a really good job over the years, since this was launched in my class a few years ago, of branding the lines of products that this company produces. And so originally the brand, by the way, was Sexy Period, which tended to be very polarizing, and lots of people really liked it, but big retailers didn't like it. And so the same technology, same products, but different branding enabled the company to succeed. And it is succeeding. It's got retail sales online. You can go to dearkates.com, and they're in boutiques and stores all over the country. And they've raised well over $1 million in capital to help them in these early stages of getting launched. So as I say, you can start with technology like G-Form. You can start with an unmet need and go find a capability like a brand that will help and invent it and help you launch a company that way. Or, and I've deliberately focused on this example because it's one where Julie and Eunice didn't have any prior entrepreneurial experience. They learned, like I hope I'm sharing today, some key principles. They applied some of what they knew through other contexts. Julie was a chemical engineer at Brown. And they've created this now successful company.
As Danny's going to now jump, I think, to a little more of the teaching part, we were hoping that while he's going through this slide, you could be thinking about what's your biggest obstacle to your venture, your venture idea, starting a venture on your side.
Sure, and I hope you'll be able to parallel process, think about that very challenging question and type it in and also listen. So the students who are or my former students who are on the line, and actually anybody who might have taken Bill Solomon's courses at Harvard Business School will recognize this, because I don't want to take credit for inventing this. But it's a model that I think is really instructive to help understand what are the key elements associated with launching and developing and succeeding in entrepreneurship. And of course, there's a long, endless list of what those elements could be. But in my classes and in my workshops and in my companies, we focus on these. And typically I find that they're not necessarily exhaustive, but they're really helpful for grounding an entrepreneur to understand what elements are really crucial. And there are four. And the model that we discuss is POCD. And I will say that it looks deceptively simple. It looks like it's obvious. Well, of course, people are really important: opportunity, context, and deal. But when you start analyzing either an existing company or the nature of a startup that you're looking at analyzing, I'll recommend that you think about these in some detail, because inevitably, if there's shortcomings in any of them, it's a reason that you might want to alter your course or substantiate them. And as you try to describe to people what you're doing in the form of a plan or a pitch or a meeting with any of the stakeholders, this might be a useful framework for how you can think about and communicate what you're doing. In fact, I've had many of my students write back to me to say, gee, we use the POCD model continually in class, and I never realized how powerful it could be until, and it may be even out of an entrepreneurial context, I was asked to assess a situation. It could have been in an interview or at a board meeting or on a nonprofit or a variety of contexts. And my heart started beating, and then I thought, Warshay's class, POCD, and they found it a very helpful way to articulate the key elements in the opportunity that they were looking at. So I won't get into too much detail about them. I'll plant these and just say briefly that POCD deliberately starts with P, because it's by far the most important element in all these things. Any investor who's online here, and I know there are several, will tell you, just like John Doerr, the most famous venture capitalist in the world, who's at Kleiner Perkins, says, that investors would much rather invest in an A team with a B idea than in a B team with an A idea. And so investors know, and good entrepreneurs know, that people are paramount. And so thinking about who you're going to partner with is really essential. The other elements, which I won't describe in too much detail, are the opportunity is really what fundamentally is the business about, how big is the opportunity, how quickly might it be growing. The context involves things that the venture doesn't have direct control over, things like the regulatory environment or the economy or pre or post 9/11. And so these are things that the venture has to grapple with and has to be aware of and has to deal with, but doesn't necessarily have direct control over. And then deals is not just related to investors, but both implicit and explicit deals that you might have with your founders, employees, vendors, people all up and down the supply chain, and of course your customers. And the last thing I'll say here is you shouldn't think about these things in isolated silos, but ultimately these all fit together. And so think about the way that they fit together, and if there's not a perfect fit among any of these, then you might want to think about substantiating them in ways that would make the venture that much more likely to succeed. Okay, so I'm going to move on to a topic that I think actually, if you learn nothing else in this, and if I share one thing that is most valuable, it's probably this next section. And it's how I think you can enable your venture or your proposed venture to have the most likely chance of succeeding. And that's about research, and it's a particular kind of research that I want to recommend. Now, most people who go to Brown are really good at this kind of research that I have on the screen now, which is what I would call top-down research. And that's where you could go to the Rock or the Sci-Li, or you could these days, don't even have to do that, you could go online and go on Google. You can find all sorts of data available online, and in not that much time and with not that much effort, you can help somebody you're talking to understand how big is a market, how quickly is it growing, what are the different segments that are divided in that market, and you can probably deliver a reasonable case for why you're paying attention at all to a particular market. But that's by far, although it's necessary, not sufficient, and it's not even close to the most useful kind of research you can do. And here's, again, drum roll, what I think is the most important thing you might learn from today or that I could share. And that's this alternative kind of way of doing research, or maybe I should say supplementary way, which most people don't do. And that's what I would call bottom-up research. And it's not secondary research where somebody else has synthesized their own primary research and is telling you things about a market. But it's more direct people-to-people research that you employ in an informal, qualitative way. And the purpose of doing it, first of all, is to enable you to perhaps even find or at least validate an unmet need. And the way you do this is trying to be what I would describe as an anthropologist. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to teach. Brown sent me and Lena Fruzetti, who maybe many of you know, a world-class anthropologist, to Portugal to teach a class on entrepreneurship with an emphasis on culture. We did that, and I learned what an anthropologist is and does. I didn't really even know what it was before that teaching experience. And anthropologists are really good at observing without influencing. And that's what I recommend you do if you're looking to start to find or validate an unmet need. You go observe people. At least you listen. And I always say that rather than pitching, you don't want to go out and pitch your idea. You just want to listen to what people's concerns are, what their pet peeves are. They may not be able to express them in a coherent, concise way, so it requires you to listen really carefully. And an example I'll quickly share with you I think will illustrate that sometimes even more than listening, and I always say you're not doing this well if you're talking more than 20% of the time. You ought to be at least listening 80% of the time. And in some cases, it's not even listening, it's observing. And the very quick anecdote I'll share is from training I got at Procter & Gamble in brand management. And they told us about this example of the Tide laundry detergent, powdered laundry detergent brand team that was trying to do some research on how they could improve their packaging. So they asked people, what do you think of our packaging? And by and large, people said, we like it. It works really well. And then they followed up with some of them, and they said, hey, could we observe you interacting with this powdered Tide product? And so they went into people's houses, and they watched how they interacted with the product. So one anecdote that I thought was really illustrative of this concept of observing, how important it is even to observe, was they watched one woman unpack her cardboard box of powdered Tide, stick it on the counter. The next thing she did is she pulled open a drawer, pulled out a really sharp knife, stabbed it in the side of the box and bore a little hole, and then used the hole to pour the powder into a measuring cup. And the brand team was horrified. They wondered, wait a minute, you told us generally that you're okay and you like this packaging. Why are you stabbing it in the side with a really sharp knife? And the woman said, well, that's how I've been interacting with Tide for as long as I've been using it. I didn't realize there would be any other way to use it, and so I guess I'm fine with it. And that insight eventually led to the advent and invention of and the launch of Liquid Tide. And so it was a great example for me to realize that sometimes listening isn't even good enough because people don't even tell you really what's on their mind or even what they think might be possible. They don't view themselves as having an unmet need. And one of the hallmarks of the kind of work that comes out of my classes is, I think if you ask any of my students, Julie, who I mentioned, and a couple others that I'll mention, the big emphasis is on bottom-up research and interacting with people in aisles of supermarkets, in their homes, in various contexts where you can discover an unmet need. And this process continues all the way through. You're never done with this, as the Tide example illustrates. So probably if you take away one thing that is useful from this process, and I'll share at the very end in my list of resources a link to a slightly longer, probably a 15-minute audio interview about this, I think this bottom-up research is the one thing that can move the needle more than anything else. And if it's okay, I'm going to share another quick example from my class, which is that there was a group of, and I'm being deliberate by saying it, I hope not sexist, 4 guys from my class who were interested in doing something in the nutrition space, but they weren't sure. And this is, to me, an excellent example of employing this approach of bottom-up research. So they were very excited to do that, and they spent a little time walking up and down the aisles at Whole Foods in the nutrition aisle. And one day, there seemed to be a number of pregnant women in that aisle, and they asked them questions about what are they looking for, what are they happy about, what are they not happy about. And the recurring insight was that these pregnant women were really dissatisfied with the approach to prenatal vitamins. And so they formed that as an insight that served as the basis for launching their company. And it's now a real company. They wrote a business plan. They, like Julie, by the way, and Dear Kate's, won the Rhode Island Business Plan competition, and they raised another $250,000 and are now raising another $1.2 million. They have product, they have revenue, and all stemming from this seemingly innocuous experience of interacting with consumers, observing them and listening to them in a context where they could learn about their unmet needs. Okay, so I'm going to transition quickly to the additional section where I'm hoping at least to leave you, if not with answers, then with questions. And sometimes, as we all know, knowing which questions to ask is as important as knowing where to find the answers. And so there's 3 key elements to, once you have an idea of where to start, whether it's with technology or a market need, and once you have an insight into what that market need may be through some top-down and bottom-up research, how do you formulate the structure of a plan that will enable you to take this forward? And so there's 3 elements: value proposition, business model, and business strategy. And to help people get started in even knowing where to start, I plant these seeds of questions. So value proposition answers 3 fundamental questions. One is, very simply, what is your product or service? The second, which is not always obvious, is who will buy it. For example, is the person buying it the same person who's using it? For children's products, for example, that's typically not the case. So the product or service might be for a child or a baby, but clearly not the consumer is the person who's buying it. And then very important is why they'll buy it, and that relates back to the kind of fundamental research we talked about. And we don't have time to dig into it, but I'm not very pedantic about many things, but the exercises I use with my students in my workshops about how to formulate and then articulate a value proposition, I do tend to be pedantic about. And inevitably, these are fundamental building blocks. And if you don't get this one right, then the rest of it falls apart. And so being really clear and really specific and articulating it to yourself and others about these three questions, I think is instructive for how you might want to start formulating a plan. Real quickly, the second element is business model. And so you can have a really well thought out, really well articulated value proposition, but that's not sufficient in order to develop a successful business, because businesses make money and you hope they make money profitably. And so the second element and the additional question that a business model tries to answer is, how are you going to make money? In particular, where are you going to be selling in the whole value chain? Are you going to be a supplier to other businesses in the supply chain? Are you going to be selling to retailers? Are you going to be selling to consumers directly? And very important, you have to consider both the revenue side of the business as well as the cost side. So first element is value proposition. Second element, which ensures that you've got a real business, is business model. And then the last questions that I usually seed with people when they're starting this process is, a strategy answers the questions of where and when. So you can have a really well-articulated and firm value proposition and business model, but then you have to be clear about where are you going to launch it and when are you going to launch it. And there's typically a couple of elements that you think about. How are you going to start? What's your entry strategy? And eventually, how are you going to expand? So the business model typically fits between the value proposition and business strategy. And I'll leave you with this picture of, in general, the kinds of questions that I think are useful to ask. And again, I'm not under any illusions. This is clearly not an exhaustive process today, but I'm hoping to plant seeds that will enable you to frame the kind of process that you need to in order at least to get started and to know the kind of direction that you might be heading in. And if you start by answering these questions, I think it'll help people to do that kind of framing process. So I was going to mention one last quick case study, again, from students in my class that I think is inspirational, and I think a good illustration of the business model issue. I think many of you may already be familiar with this company called Runa. It was launched from my undergraduate class a number of years ago. There were 5 students in the group, and now 2 that are full-time carrying it forward, and the rest are advisors and board members. And this was born out of a passion for both doing well and doing good, which is, I think, a common theme at Brown, and certainly a common theme in my classes, and I know among many alums who are on this call now. Runa had access to a proprietary herb in Ecuador that they had discovered when one of the team members had been spending time in Ecuador. It's an herb called guayusa that has some unusual energy properties when you drink it. Very high in a certain kind of caffeine that doesn't give you jitters and enables you to be really focused and provide sustained energy. And it's a herb that's been used indigenously in traditional kinds of families in Ecuador for many, many years. So Runa developed its own supply chain of guayusa, now employing over 70 people. They are reforesting the Amazon. They've created a fair trade network with farmers in Ecuador who had never been paid a fair trade before. And then they had to decide, and this is why it's relevant to this discussion of business model, where in the value chain, in the supply chain, they wanted to focus. Did they want to be a supplier of Wyusa to other tea manufacturers and energy beverage companies? Or did they want to take it all the way through that supply chain and create their own consumer products? And that's what they did. They have created that supply chain that they control in a proprietary way that's respectful of Ecuadorian farmers and respectful of the environment. And in fact, that supply chain is controlled by a foundation that's been funded separately through several $100,000 by the Ecuadorian government and other NGOs around the world. And in addition, they've created a separate for-profit entity in the United States that's now raised over $5 million in capital to develop and now distribute its tea products and its bottled energy beverages, which you see on the left-hand side of this slide, in over 2,500 stores, including Whole Foods and Wegmans and Fresh Market, Stop and Shop, and many others all around the country. So if you're in any of those stores, you might want to try Runa. It tastes great. It has this very interesting property of sustained energy, and it also has the ancillary benefit of supporting a fair trade supply chain in Ecuador.
Okay.
Heather, I know you have been getting some questions in. I don't know if now's a reasonable time to switch gears to that. I'm also happy to talk about other topics, however you'd like to do it.
We have gotten a couple of questions, and one came in shortly after you were talking about yourself, wondering if you felt like that MBA experience was something that you really needed to have. And I know now that you've talked a little bit about working with your students, but I wonder if you could talk about that process of, do I go through the MBA program or not?
Sure, and I'm asked that a lot, given the different kinds of positions I'm in, and also because I went to business school. So the short answer is, of course not. You certainly don't have to go to business school to do anything, certainly not to be a successful entrepreneur. I mean, there's many, many famous examples of lots of entrepreneurs who didn't go to or didn't finish college, and let alone go to business school. For me, business school was, I think, very helpful as a grounding in fundamental business issues that I had not been exposed to in the couple of startups that I was part of before I went. And so it was an accelerated way for me to learn a lot of things from an academic side of things that, as I say, accelerated that process. Probably the most important thing I got out of business school, though, was what everybody predicted, and that was a network. And people said, oh, well, I understand why you're going to business school. It's for the network. And I thought, well, geez, it's going to cost me a lot of money, a lot of opportunity cost. I have a ton to learn, and I hope I'm going to get more than a network out of it. The truth is I did get a lot of things, and probably the most valuable thing was the network. So I don't necessarily think at all it's the right thing for everybody. A number of my students now are transitioning to applying to business school and going to business school, but by no means do I think it's necessary to be successful in anything, let alone successful as an entrepreneur.
Okay, great. I have a couple of questions coming in about, that startup process. And the first one is, when we were talking about obstacles, was a big obstacle being your prototype development. Can you talk a little bit about how much time you should spend with that process, maybe, where you should go to help get that solved?
Sure. I'm glad that was raised. And it's, I hope, helpful to put it in the context of what I described as absolutely critical, and that's bottom-up research. So I know that there's a revolution in entrepreneurship. I think it's probably not too strong a word, called lean startup. And lean startup, I think, is really an excellent method of developing a startup. And we don't have a lot of time to go into it, but one of the real central features of that is creating a bare bones, minimally viable prototype. And it enables you to get some real feedback on what you're proposing to bring to market. And I do think that's important and not in every case necessary, but it's a critical step. And these days, with lots of different kinds of technology, especially if you were proposing to do something online, it would be essential to develop a prototype, and you can do that pretty cost effectively. I mean, especially on a college campus, there's plenty of people who know how to program. And so if it's an online thing, there's very little downside, especially cost downside, to doing that. If it's a physical product, you can do that in much more cost-effective methods than you ever could with 3D printers and even just quickly developing something in your basement. You can do that. But the mistake I see entrepreneurs making, especially ones following this lean startup method, is rushing past that really critical bottom-up research element and quickly putting together a prototype and then running around and asking people for feedback on it. And typically, when you ask people for feedback on something you're pitching at that early stage, a couple of extreme things might happen. One extreme would be that people say they love it because they don't want to disappoint you. They can see the passion that you have behind it, and it doesn't cost them anything to tell you how much they love it. So they figure they're doing you a favor by encouraging you. In fact, they're not if they're not telling you the truth, but it's hard to give, especially somebody you know, constructive, critical feedback. Or the other extreme is people say, I hate it. And they'll say they hate it because, let's face it, it's a prototype and maybe it doesn't look so great. Or they do think you're trying to sell them something and they're getting defensive. And neither extreme tends to work. And so that's why I say I don't like the idea of pitching or even disclosing or showing people your product, or even in some cases talking about your product. I much prefer, at first at least, observing and listening so you can tell whether the track you think you might be on is a track that's worth pursuing, even before you invest whatever minimal dollars in time you have to invest in a prototype. So I hope that's a more complete answer than just, is a prototype good and how do you do it?
I think that's addressing and leading us to a couple of the other questions that are coming in about when do you start, how do you start, and I know that that's something that you and I had talked a lot about, jumping in quickly. A couple of people saying, there was a really good question. How long do you wait before you're raising funding? A lot of questions coming in about funding, and I would like to say that we did talk about, there was a nice little spreadsheet on the last webinar we did with Jose Estevil about funding. But can you talk a little bit about that? How long do you wait? When do you jump in? When do you know if you have enough? And a little bit about worrying about the funding.
Sure. I mean, when do you jump in is, of course, very personally motivated. There may be all sorts of circumstances that will motivate you or preclude you from, quote, jumping in based on where you are in your life. My students often ask me, should they dive in and do something entrepreneurially? And I always ask them, well, what are your alternatives? And I share my own experience of when I was much younger, around their age, having dived into a couple of startups. And it was a fantastic experience because I felt like I had really little to lose. You get a little later in life and you have children and a mortgage and a lot of opportunity cost, and it becomes much more difficult to do that. So part of it relates nothing to do with the specific venture, but much more to do with your specific station in life. And for the folks who are younger on the phone, recent alums, just consider that it may be the best time for you to start something. Now, sometimes young alums will approach me about that, and they don't really have a specific opportunity that they're jumping into. So instead, what I usually recommend is that they go get some experience in a context in which they think they might be working, if it's technology, maybe a software company, or if it's manufacturing, and manufacturing environment. Go to the best learning environment you can. Learn, contribute, and most important, build a network. That recently happened. I don't know if Bart Stein's on the call, but Bart was one of my early students. He went to work at Google. He learned a ton about that industry. He left a couple of years ago with two other Google employees. They started something in that environment called Stamped. Turns out they were funded by another Brown alum from my class, Scott Friend from Bain Capital. The two of them actually had met when Scott came to my class as a speaker. And just recently, they were really excited to announce that Yahoo bought them for what was reported in the Wall Street Journal of tens of millions of dollars. And it was Yahoo, the new CEOs of Yahoo's first acquisition. So that to me was a good example of what I'm saying, which is at the time Bart was talking about starting something, he didn't really have a burning desire or a specific idea. He went to an environment where he learned a lot, he contributed a lot, and he met a lot of people. That also may tell you something about the funding spectrum you were asking about. At the time, actually, and I don't think this is necessarily true of everybody, but Bart had done a really good job of nurturing a relationship with a prospective funder, so that long before he was in the position of having to actually raise money, Scott knew him, and Scott was already prompting him to say, come see me when you have a plan. So one issue is develop relationships, the adage, dig your well long before you're thirsty. And so it's much easier to go to speak to people about funding when you already know them, they already respect and trust you, than when you're just knocking on their door, which is really hard to do to get a funding source to pay attention to you.
There's a couple of questions coming in about funding, but there's also some more questions about the bottoms up. So one question is, how do you gauge when you've acquired enough data in your research? Is there a sort of guideline for potential customers, or is there anything like that that you emphasize in your class?
So that's a good question, and it's hard to specify. And keep in mind that the bottom-up research I'm talking about is anecdotal. It's qualitative, so it's by no means exhaustive. I'm specifically not recommending that you do surveys that are impersonal or doing a ton of this kind of bottom-up research, but to give you some benchmark, students in my class who are, as you see, increasingly launching companies spend a total of about 12 weeks over the course of a semester doing the entire project. And so the initial bottom-up research takes them a couple of weeks. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily the ideal. Depending on what kind of venture, you may need more than that. But it's about building confidence that you're on the right track, because it's very costly, very expensive. You don't want to spend the hard-earned resources that you've raised to this question of raising money, finding out that you put all that money into the wrong direction. You want to get some insights ahead of time about whether directionally you're headed appropriately. And then you want to fail fast. You want to make your mistakes, translate those mistakes into the next version, and continue with iterating, developing new prototypes without putting all the resources in one direction. So I don't know that I can answer the question universally, but maybe to frame it in general, it's certainly not, at least in the entrepreneurial environment, years. It may be a few months, and it could be as little as a few weeks, at least to make sure that you're confident, you feel confident. It's not something you can analytically assess, but at least you feel more confident about the direction you're headed in.
Another great question, because you talked a lot about people being the most important, is, what would you look for in your initial team other than bringing a new skill?
Well, often, and this I think contradicts what I'm illustrating about people without experience, but sometimes it is really important to have people involved who have experience. And experience doesn't always mean successes. Sometimes failures are a good experience because people will learn what not to do. And sometimes that's the role that I play in the ventures that I'm involved with, where G-Form is an example where I am involved day to day, but most of the ventures I'm involved with, I'm not involved day to day. But I can leverage the experience I've had in my own startups or others that I've joined, where I've learned either some things you should do or some hard lessons about things to avoid. And so there's plenty of people around who have that experience, who can get involved in an early stage startup. They may be an investor writing a check, or they may not be writing a check, and they can add a lot of value based on the experience that they've had. That's usually what I recommend in the extreme case of my students, who have all the passion in the world for what they're doing, but just haven't had the experience doing what they're proposing to do. And so you can add a lot of credibility to your team, not window dressing, because you can't really fool people with that. But I'm talking about actual substance that doesn't require a ton of time or effort, but can be advisory that enables somebody to add value based on what they've already done and learned in their own trajectory.
A couple of people are asking about, what do you think about having a mentor, or the importance of a mentor in your startup?
Well, so that I think relates to what I just said, and I think it's critical. And that's really a good way to describe some of the advisors who I often recommend surrounding a core team. Now, they can be from different disciplines. They might know a lot about, for example, in Runa's case, I hope I'm not telling tales out of school, they had an excellent mentor from a very big consumer beverage company who knew everything you would want to know about logistics. there's no reason that 5 Brown students would know anything about worldwide complicated beverage logistics. And so they brought somebody on as part of their advisory group. As it turned out, I helped them form this group of advisors. And there's an art to doing it. There's an art to knowing how to compensate and motivate them. But one of the really key elements was this logistics person who was, I think the word is nice, it's a mentor to help them fill some gaps.
As part of that gap, one of the listeners is asking about hiring startup incubators. Do you have any thoughts about that?
So I'm glad you planted that seed. So the newly fashioned phrase is less incubator and more accelerator. And I'm sure there's many people on the call who know about accelerators. And by the term, it's designed to move the process forward quickly. And very much to the last question, provide these nascent startups with exceptional mentorship. Because for all of what I just said in praise of mentors, it's sometimes difficult to find them. And even if you find them, to be credible enough to attract them to spend any time or effort or resources on your behalf. And so accelerators, as it turns out, and there are many, many accelerators around the country and around the world, do this very well. One in particular that I wanted to plug is called Accelerate, E-X-C-E-L-E-R-A-T-E. It's in Chicago, and it's been recognized as one of the top 3 accelerators out of hundreds. And it's started by a Brown alum, Troy Henikoff, who is a very close friend of mine, a former colleague of mine at a startup in Chicago. And Troy's team at Accelerate does a great job of selecting, and it's a very selective process, teams who have a passion, a mission, and I know Troy even says on the video that is featured on their homepage that what they're really looking for is people with an excellent opportunity. And so those are 2 elements of this POCD approach that I mentioned, people and opportunity. Now, Accelerate certainly isn't the only one. You can find accelerators in lots of different cities, but it's a good vehicle that you might consider as a way to jumpstart your venture with a little bit of money, some infrastructure, and most important probably access to world-class mentors. And I suspect that if you emailed Troy at Accelerate, he would be willing to tell you not only about his own accelerator, but perhaps also about accelerators in general.
Okay, we're running close on time, but I did have a question about patents and lawyers and, when do you need to do that? Is there a quick answer for that?
Well, that's probably, in fact, yesterday I gave a different presentation for the Technology Ventures office here at Brown, and it was all focused on intellectual property. A big part of G-Form, for example, and it's true in lots of technology-based startups where you're starting with technology, you have to be careful in those circumstances about disclosing it in ways that would invalidate a patent application. So I will say in general, I usually advise people not to be as paranoid as they tend to be about sharing ideas, because I think usually the benefits outweigh the costs of sharing them because you can get really valuable feedback. The one significant caveat to that is if you have actual technology and disclosing it will invalidate the protection that you can enjoy from patents. So G-Form has 73 patents and 105 trademarks, and we're really careful about the process we use of when to disclose those. In fact, we've spent so much time, effort, resources, money on patents that we've brought our intellectual property counsel in-house. So that would be the only exception. Other issue real quickly about lawyers separate from intellectual property. Lawyers are necessary for documenting some of the key issues here, especially the deals pillar of that POCD. But make sure you're dealing with a lawyer who's an expert in this kind of work. You don't want to hire your aunt who happens to be a real estate lawyer or your uncle who knows a lot about criminal law. You want to hire a lawyer who knows and has expertise about entrepreneurship. So I know that you wanted me to share some resources. Should we just mention real quickly the page of resources in here? I won't go through them, just mention that they're there.
I would like to mention those, but I would like for you to touch on that idea about leveraging partnerships, because with your technology and the way you did that, I thought that was great information that I would like
to do that.
share.
I just thought we might be running out of time. So there are a couple slides in here that make different points. I'm happy to talk about those another time. But one that Heather just mentioned is this concept of partnerships, and it's often one that's overlooked by really early stage startups who have something valuable. They may have something proprietary, some technology that would be valuable not only to consumers, but also to a partner. And so what I have on the slide here is not intended to be X-rated. It's to illustrate a partnership that G-Form has established in a segment of business that we ourselves aren't capable of tackling. It's in the medical field to protect seniors from the impact of falls that might break their hips. And each hip fracture could lead to serious injury, if not death in circumstance, and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. We, G-Form, have partnered with a company that's expert in that field to leverage their understanding, insights into the field, and very much their distribution. And so even with companies much earlier stage, if it could be, than G-Form, you might be just one person in a lab that has some proprietary technology that you don't want to develop into a full-fledged company, and instead might be useful to a strategic partner. Could be a very big company. Procter & Gamble, where I used to work, is doing this quite a bit, where they are bringing in, through an open innovation process, technologies from outside the company that can enjoy the fruits of Procter & Gamble's staff and resources and distribution. And so you might consider this either as adjunct, the way it's happening in G-Form, or as an alternative to developing your own fully fledged company, and use that as a mechanism for taking your opportunity forward.
Thank you. I wanted to be sure we got that information. I've taken back those slides from you, and we do have these recommended resources. The
only one I thought I might underscore, the others I think are self-explanatory. I tended to use the old-fashioned books, although each one is available in some kind of e-form as well. These are many of the resources that I use and recommend in my teaching all over the world. And the last item is a link to the open book. It's to the, it should say bottom-up research interview. We'll have to change that. It's an interview about bottom-up research. And bottom-up research, as you've heard, is such a critical part of what I recommend that I wanted to share a link to that interview.
I know some of you are really probably struggling for time, so I wanted to be sure you had some ways to follow up. Danny, do you have any last words?
No, just that I'm flattered to have been asked to do this. I'm thrilled that I could share some of this, and I hope it's useful.
Okay, thank you. Take a few minutes to end up and finish the poll, but we are going to sign off. Thank you.